All right, folks, let's get started with chapter 27. It's a long one, at least in terms of number of sections, so we'll get started. All right, so there's 8 sections here. We'll take them one at a time as we always do, and here's your first focus question. President George H.W. Bush's first major foreign policy action seemed to be a return to U.S. interventionism in the Western Hemisphere. In 1989, Bush sent troops to Panama to overthrow the government of Manuel Antonio Noriega, a former U.S. ally who had become involved in the international drug trade. The U.S. installed a new government and tried Noriega in the American courts. A far more serious crisis arose in 1990, I should say, when Iraq invaded and annexed Kuwait, an oil-rich sheikdom in the Persian Gulf. The Iraqi invasion under Saddam Hussein flagrantly violated international law that Bush succeeded in building a 40-nation coalition that was committed to restoring Kuwait's independence, secured the support of the United Nations, and sent 500,000 American troops along with a naval armada to the region. In February 1991, the United States launched Operation Desert Storm, which quickly drove the Iraqi army from Kuwait. The United Nations ordered Iraq to disarm and imposed economic sanctions that produced widespread civilian suffering for the rest of the decade. But Hussein remained in place. So did a large American military establishment in Saudi Arabia, to the outrage of Islamic fundamentalists who deemed its presence an affront to their faith. The Gulf War was the first post-Cold War international crisis. Relying on high-tech weaponry, the United States was able to prevail quickly and avoid a prolonged involvement and high casualties. In the war's immediate aftermath, Bush's public approval rating rose to an unprecedented 89%. In 1991, the economy slipped into a recession. Unemployment skyrocketed and family income stagnated. Widespread unease about America's future gripped the public, and Bill Clinton, the former governor of Arkansas, seized the Democratic nomination the next year by advocating both social liberalism, like support for gay rights, abortion rights, and affirmative action, and conservatism, of opposition to bureaucracy and welfare. Clinton was very charismatic and seemed interested in voters' economic fears, and he blamed rising inequalities and job loss on deindustrialization. Bush, by contrast, seemed unaware of ordinary Americans' lives and problems. Republican attacks on gays, feminists, and abortion rights also alienated voters. A third candidate, eccentric Texas billionaire Ross Perot, also ran for president, attacking Bush and Clinton for not having the economic skills to combat the recession and the national debt. Although he enjoyed much support at first, Perot's candidacy waned. Nonetheless, he received 19% of the popular vote. Clinton won by a substantial margin, humiliating Bush, who only recently had been very popular. Clinton at first seemed to repudiate the policies of Reagan and Bush. He appointed several women and blacks to his cabinet and named supporters of abortion rights to the Supreme Court. He also revised the military's strict ban on gay soldiers, instituting a don't ask, don't tell policy, by which officers would not seek out gays for dismissal from the military. His first budget raised taxes on the wealthy and expanded tax credits for low-income workers, which lifted more than 4 million Americans out of poverty. But Clinton shared with his predecessors a passion for free trade. Despite strong opposition from unions and environmentalists, in 1993 he got Congress to pass the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which created a free trade zone encompassing Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The major policy initiative of Clinton's first term, however, was the attempt with his wife, Hillary Clinton, to address the rising cost of health care and the increasing number of Americans who lacked health insurance. In Canada and Western Europe, governments provided universal medical coverage. Yet the United States, with the world's most advanced medical technology, had a very incomplete health insurance system. The Great Society had given coverage to the elderly and poor in Medicare and Medicaid, and many employers offered health insurance to their workers, yet tens of millions of Americans had no coverage. However, the plan proved to be too complex and seemed to expand the unpopular federal bureaucracy, and it expired in 1994. A slow economic recovery and few accomplishments in Clinton's first 2 years turned voters against him. In the 1994 elections, Republicans won control of both houses of Congress, the first time since the 1950s. They called their victory the Freedom Revolution. Newt Gingrich, a conservative Georgia congressman who became Speaker of the House, led the campaign. Gingrich devised a platform called the Contract with America, which promised to reduce government, taxes, and economic and environmental regulations, overhaul welfare, and end affirmative action. Republicans moved quickly to implement the contract's provisions. The House made deep cuts in social, educational, and environmental programs, including the popular Medicare system. But with the president and Congress unable to compromise, the government shut down all non-essential operations in late 1995. It became clear that most voters had not voted for the Republicans and Gingrich's contract with America, but rather against Clinton, and Congress soon retreated. Clinton rebuilt his popularity by campaigning against a radical Congress. He opposed the most extreme parts of the Republican program, but embraced others. In early 1996, he declared that the era of big government was over, repudiating Democratic Party liberalism and embracing the anti government attitude of conservatives. He approved acts to deregulate broadcasting and telephone companies. In 1996, over Democratic protests, he also abolished aid to families with dependent children, commonly known as welfare. At that time, 14 million Americans, including 9 million children, received welfare assistance. Stringent new eligibility requirements at the state level and economic growth reduced welfare rolls, but the number of children in poverty stayed the same. Clinton thus neutralized Republican charges that the Democrats wanted to raise taxes and assist the idle. Clinton's passion for free trade convinced middle class voters that the Democrats were not dominated by unions. In 1996, Clinton, who had consolidated the conservative shift away from Democratic liberalism, easily defeated Bob Dole, the Republican candidate, in the presidential election. Like Carter, Clinton was most interested in domestic affairs and took steps to settle persistent international conflicts and promote human rights. However, he was only partly successful. He strongly supported the 1993 Oslo Accords, in which Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization and a plan for peace was outlined, but neither side fully implemented the accords. Israel continued to build Jewish settlements on Palestinian land in the West Bank, a part of Jordan that Israel had occupied since the 1967 Six-Day War. Pardon me, the new Palestinian Authority, which shared in governing parts of the West Bank on the way to full statehood, was corrupt, powerless, and unable to check groups that attacked Israel. At the end of his presidency, Clinton brought leaders from the two sides to Camp David to try to work out a final peace treaty, but the meeting failed and violence resumed. Like Carter, Clinton found it difficult to balance concern for human rights with U.S. strategic and economic interests and to form guidelines for humanitarian intervention overseas. The United States did nothing when tribal massacres in Rwanda killed more than 800,000 people and created 2 million refugees during the Rwandan genocide. Clinton also faced a crisis in Yugoslavia, a multi ethnic state that started to disintegrate in the 1990s after its communist government collapsed in 1989. In a few years, 5 new states emerged in the country, and ethnic violence plagued several of these new nations. In 1992, Serbs in Bosnia, which was on the historic boundary between Christianity and Islam in southeastern Europe, started a war to drive out Muslims and Croats. The Serbs used mass murder and rape as military strategies, which came to be known as ethnic cleansing, the forcible expulsion from an area of a particular ethnic group. And this was during the conflict that became called the Balkan Crisis. More than 100,000 Bosnians, mostly civilians, had been killed by the end of 1993. After long inaction, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, launched airstrikes against Bosnian Serb troops, and UN troops, including 20,000 Americans, arrived as peacekeepers. In 1998, when Yugoslavian troops and local Serbs started to revive ethnic cleansing, this time against Albanians in Kosovo, a Serbian province, nearly 1 million Albanians fled. NATO launched a 2-month war in 1999 that led to the deployment of U.S. and UN troops in Kosovo. So that's the end of our first section. We'll be back for the second.